Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Peter Thal, Larsen from Reuters Breaking Views, and I'm here to moderate this session. The way this is going to work is that Arthur is going to start with a presentation that he's prepared about the state of the Chinese economy, and amazingly, he's going to keep it down to about half an hour. Hopefully that will give us lots of food for thought and for discussion. So after that, I'll ask him a few questions, but also very keen to hear your questions, comments, observations, anything you might have. So there'll be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And I'm informed that if you want to buy a copy of Arthur's book, he will be sitting outside at the end of this session and will sign your book. So make sure you don't leave without a copy as well. But in the meantime, let me just start by introducing Arthur Kroeber. Arthur.
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad to be here. And what I thought I would do today is sketch out a few ideas about how China came to its position as the world's second biggest economy, the world's biggest trading nation, and an economy, a country that basically no country in the world today can afford to ignore. So I'll explain a little bit how I think China got to that position. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that it faces today, which are quite large. And then I'll end with consideration of a couple of scenarios for how I think China might develop over the next 10 years. And then hopefully there'll be some opportunity to discuss any questions that you might have about that, or implications, what all this might mean for Hong Kong. Just a little bit of introduction about myself. I first came to China, I grew up in New York. I first came to China in 1986 as a tourist. I first started living in Beijing in 1991, where I spent a year learning Chinese. And since the early 90s, I have mainly been based in China. I've had a few stints in other parts of Asia, initially as kind of a freelance journalist and analyst specializing in financial and economic issues. And then in 2002, I set up my own company called Dragonomics, based in Beijing, to analyze the Chinese economy for the benefit of corporations and financial institutions that needed to understand it. A few years later, my company Dragonomics merged with a Hong Kong-based research company called GavCal, which has been established here since the early 2000s. GavCal is a global macroeconomic research company. We have 900 institutional clients around the world. And so we provide them with information not only about China through the original team in Beijing, but also about the rest of the world economy. So I've spent many, many years at both very low levels and at somewhat higher levels trying to understand the complexity that is China. And I don't know anywhere near to all of it. It's much too big and complicated a place for any one person to understand fully, but I've tried to pull together what I've learned over the last 20-odd years into this book, China's Economy. And what I try to do in the book is give an introduction to how China works economically, where it came from, where it is, and where it's going, in a way that's understandable for an ordinary person who pays attention to the news, but doesn't necessarily have any particular background or specialization in economics. So it's very much meant for the general reader as an introduction to the key points that you need to know. And it's also intended for use in undergraduate classrooms as a textbook. And in fact, I teach a course at Columbia University in New York in the fall, and of course I will be using my book as the textbook when my students convene in September. So with that introduction, general introduction, I will now flip back from my advertisement to the topic of today's talk, which is China's economy, Powerhouse, Menace of the Next Japan. And what I mean to suggest by that title is that I think China is facing some very difficult economic transformations in the years ahead. There are several different pathways that it could go. It could become a very successful economy. It's possible that it could face some kind of very deep financial or economic crisis, and if it did so, that would cause a lot of trouble for a lot of other countries in the rest of the world. So that's kind of what the menace implies. And then the next, Japan, is kind of an ambiguous thing, but the suggestion there is that I think there is also some possibility that, or risk, that over the next few years, China's policymakers could make some of the mistakes that were made by Japanese policymakers back in the 1990s. And if that occurs, then there's also some risk that China winds up in a kind of an economic trap that's not too different from what we've seen in Japan. So let me first spell out my understanding of how China got to where it is, because I think this is very important background for understanding where it's going. And I basically present here three elements to the recipe, three ingredients for how China got to be such a successful economy. And the first ingredient is that it picked up a mode or a recipe for economic growth that had been tested out first by Japan, then by South Korea, and then by Taiwan very successfully after World War II. And economists sometimes call this the East Asian Developmental State Model. And the elements of this model are pretty straightforward. The idea is that if you're a poor country, mainly agricultural, and you want to get rich, the way you do it is, number one, you look at agriculture and you try to divide the land so that it's held by individual farmers in small plots rather than by big barons in plantations. And the reason that you do that is, first of all, when you have a lot of labor, it's much more productive to have your land held by small independent farmers. They tend to generate much greater produce out of their land than big plantation owners. And then the other reason to do it is that as many countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia have discovered, if you have a political system that is dominated by big agricultural plantation owners, they tend to prevent progress towards industrialization. So for that reason, you need to focus on agriculture first. Then the second step is, once you've done that successfully, you have very productive farmers, and they're generating a lot of income. And there's some extra left over. And so you have a financial system that captures this income. And the financial system can either be owned by the state or simply directed by the state. It really doesn't matter, but it has to be controlled. And then what do you do with all of this money once you've captured it? Basically, you invest it in two things. You invest it in infrastructure, so the roads, the ports, the electricity, the telecom system, and the educational systems that you need to create modern industrial society. And then you also invest it in export-oriented manufacturing. And the key behind exports is that if you have a closed economy where people are just selling to each other, it's very easy for the successful companies to rig the market by going to the government and saying, help me out and let me win and I'll pay you off. Whereas if you're operating in a global market where you have to compete against companies from all over the world, there's no one place that you can go to rig the market. So the only way you can win is by getting better and better each year and adopting the latest technology. So it's a fairly simple, straightforward recipe in concept. It's hard to execute. And the point is that when China wanted to enter the global economy in 1980 or so, it looked around the world and said, who has done this well? Who has gone from being a poor country to a rich country successfully? And the conclusion that they came to was that their neighbors in East Asia had done the best job. So they copied most of that program very successfully. There are two differences in China that are quite important. One is that unlike the other countries in East Asia, China relied heavily on investment by foreign companies. So Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they basically operated closed economies where foreign companies didn't invest. China did rely much more heavily on foreign direct investment, or FDI, and I'll come back in a minute to why I think they did that. The other difference, obviously, is that there was a much heavier reliance in China on the state economy, state-owned enterprises. And this was a legacy of the fact that China was a communist economy fully through the 1970s. And so this was the second element of China's success, is that they're really the only economy that has succeeded over a very long time in transitioning from a communist planned economy to a market economy while retaining the communist political leadership. And so how have they done this? The simple answer is that Chinese leaders in the 1980s understood that the key to a successful market economy was not handing over all the assets into society to private entrepreneurs. That was the mistake that Russia made in the 1990s, was that it decided to privatize all its assets. It did it very badly, and it created a lot of economic chaos. The Chinese leadership decided, no, the key to a successful market economy is not who owns the assets, it's whether there's competition. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on increasing more market forces, increasing competition, and then whoever owns the assets, state companies, private companies, because they'll have to face competition, they'll have to improve their game. And I'm simplifying a lot, obviously, but broadly speaking, that was a critical insight, and it has enabled China's economy over many decades to retain a high degree of state ownership that is very unusual among successful modern economies, but to continue seeing a lot of progress. And as it did so, gradually over time, you saw more and more of the economy being taken over by the private sector, not because state assets were privatized, but because as the economy grew, there was more and more space. There were new niches for new companies, startup companies, to enter, and these were founded by private entrepreneurs. So over time, you had a gradual shift of resources from the state sector to the private sector. Private sector tends to be much more productive than the state sector, and again, this provided another source of economic growth. The third element, I think, in China's success relates to the political system, and this is really, I think, the way in which China is pretty much unique. And unlike pretty much any other country, China has a combination of a highly centralized government and a highly decentralized government. So you have a state centered in Beijing that theoretically controls everything and makes all the decisions. But as any of you know who've actually been to China or done business there or had to do anything there, decision-making on the ground at the local level, local government level, is extremely powerful. So in principle, it's a highly centralized system. In practice, it's a highly decentralized system. And what this has enabled is for China to have the best of both worlds. When you need a centralized government that, for example, you need to build an entire interstate highway system in 10 years, or an entire high-speed rail network in 10 years, the central government can come in and mobilize the resources and make it happen. So those big-scale infrastructure projects, China does extraordinarily effectively. But when you need innovation bubbling up from the bottom and a lot of private entrepreneurship, you have that too. The Soviet Union was an example of a country that had too much centralization, and it squashed the private entrepreneurship, so they could do some of the big projects, but they couldn't do any of the small ones. China escaped from that trap. So those are, I think, some of the elements that enabled China to grow. I think I want to throw two more things into the pot to complete our understanding of what China is about. So what I've just given you is the drivers of growth, things that help China grow. What I want to add is two political constraints that limit the ability of policymakers or force them to act in certain ways and not in other ways. And this is important, I think, for understanding the policy choices that China has in the years ahead. So there's one domestic constraint and there's one international constraint. So the domestic constraint is, as we all know, China is governed by a single party, the Communist Party, which has decreed that it's going to be the ruling party forever and no competition will ever be permitted. And this creates a problem. And as long as I've been coming to China, people have been visiting it from the US and Europe and other places saying, this doesn't make any sense. You've got a dynamic, increasingly capitalist, market-driven economy, but it's governed by this old-fashioned one-party Leninist state. These two things can't possibly coexist. So either the political system is going to have to change or collapse, or the economy will stop growing. And people have been saying this for 30 years, and for 30 years they've been completely wrong. The economy has broken all kinds of growth records, and the Communist Party is even more strongly in control now than it was 25 or 30 years ago. So how can this be? It's a very difficult problem, but I think the basic answer is that the elite in the Communist Party for most of the last 3 decades has understood very clearly that for them to remain in power forever the way they want to, and to retain control forever, they have to have a dynamic economy. They've studied the Soviet Union twice and why it failed. And one of the reasons that they came to, one of the conclusions that they came to was that the Soviet Union collapsed in part because they mismanaged their economy and did not create sustained growth and living standards that made the people view the Communist Party as a legitimate ruler. So they've taken a very clear lesson from that. If we want to survive as the sole rulers of China, we have to get the economy right. And what that means is sometimes in the short term, what we need to grow the economy goes against what we want in terms of maximizing our control right now over prices or over assets in the state sector or over manufacturing or over trade. And the decision has been made time and time again, okay, well, we don't really like it, but we will give up a little bit of control here, a little bit of control there to get more economic growth because we know in the long run, 5 or 10 years down the road, we as the party will benefit from that. So they've been very, very skillful at making the trade-offs between what I call the control agenda and the growth agenda. And I think one of the critical problems today in Xi Jinping's China is it is much less clear whether the government is still willing to make the trade-offs between the control agenda and the growth agenda. And that's why I think there's so much uncertainty about where China is going, because that a contradiction is sharper than ever before. So that's the domestic constraint. The international constraint is that different to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, China is an independent geopolitical actor that is not part of the U.S. security system. And I think particularly Americans who are blind to many things tend to forget this when they look at China. They don't understand that the kinds of choices that became possible for the countries that were part of the U.S. security system are not really choices that are available to China. So I think there are a couple of implications of this. One is, I mentioned earlier that China was much more welcoming of foreign companies into its economy than the other East Asian countries. Why? Well, I think one reason is that Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they basically, after World War II, they had a deal with the U.S. And the deal was, the U.S. said to them, you are the front lines of our security network in Asia. We'll put our bases there. We'll put our troops there. And in exchange for that, you can run your economies any way you want. You can have all the access you want to the U.S. market, and we're not going to try and get U.S. companies in here. That's not a big deal for us because we're getting what we want out of you, namely the security deal. When China entered the global system in the early 1980s, they couldn't get that deal because they didn't want to be part of the U.S. security alliance. So they had to have some other ticket of entry into the global economic system, which is essentially run by the U.S. And that ticket was, okay, we will give your companies access to this giant market that is China. So I think that was a trade-off that they had to make because they faced a very different geopolitical situation. Today, it's a little bit different. China is much bigger. It's much more powerful. And it now has a view that, okay, we maybe want to change the rules of the game, or maybe we want to have a new game altogether. So I think the fact that China is an independent geopolitical actor means that its relationship to the global economic system is much more complicated and fraught. And it's very difficult for Chinese leaders to decide how much do we want to participate in this system that's run by the US, how much do we want to participate in it but try and change the rules, and how much do we just want to set up a whole new system where we write the rules. And I think if you read the news today, you can easily think of a dozen ways in which this is playing out. So that's the background. That's how China got to be where it is. That's the sort of the political constraints on its decision making. What are the challenges that China faces today? So we all know China has been terrifically successful, 10% growth for 30 years in a row, one of the best economic growth stories of all time, hundreds of millions of people raised out of poverty, a truly stunning achievement. But I think it's also very clear that what worked for a very long time is no longer working. So China is no longer growing at 10%. It's growing at, the government says, 6.5%. Most private economists think it's a little less than that. It's still a pretty good growth rate, but it's a lot slower than it was before. And there are a lot of people who say, look, you can't continue on the route that you are now because you're relying too much on debt. You're still relying too much on old industries like steel and cement and construction and so forth. So there's a very clear sense that what worked in the past is not going to work in the future, and change is required. So what is the nature of that change? And fundamentally, I think this comes down to one thing, which is that for most of the last 30 or 35 years, the big job in China was simply to increase its capital or to mobilize resources. The difference between a poor country and a rich country is that a rich country has a lot more capital to deal with. Typically, it has capital that's equal to 3 times annual GDP. A poor country like China was in the late 1970s might have capital that's only worth 1 or 1.5 times annual GDP. So when you're starting out poor and you're trying to get rich, your first job is to build up huge capital resources. And this is things like infrastructure, roads, power stations, telecoms networks, ports, railways, housing for all the people who have to move to the cities, et cetera. And so for a long time, you can have a lot of growth that is driven mainly by just throwing more and more and more capital into the system. But ultimately, you get to a point where you've built so much capital that you have enough, basically. You don't need to build that much more. And so the amount of growth that you can get by throwing more capital into the system decreases to a very low number. And after that, almost all of your growth has to come simply by using your assets, your resources more efficiently and generating a higher return on the capital that you've already installed. And that is the transition that China has to go through now. And the problem is that while you're building all of these capital resources, there's certain tools that are very useful to you, including state-owned enterprises. And those tools may not be so effective when the job changes to not just building stuff, but to maximizing the usefulness of it. And so fundamentally, when you make this shift from capital mobilization to efficiency, you have to switch from state-led mechanisms to more market-led and more private mechanisms. And that's very, very difficult. So that's the economic challenge that China is facing. And if you want, when people talk about the middle income trap, basically what they're talking about is this transition from just mobilizing a lot of resources to using your resources more efficiently. You need different structures, different institutions. It's very hard to make that change. Many countries fail. So the second problem that China faces is as they are trying to go through this very, very difficult economic transition, they also are moving from a young society to an old society. So I think everyone knows in general that China is aging. I'll have a chart in a minute that explains just how it's aging. But the simple point is that when you're a young society, it tends to be very dynamic. You have a lot of people working, not so many people in retirement age. It's very easy to have a lot of economic growth. When you're an old society, you have less workers, you have more people in retirement who need to be supported, and that tends to be a drag on economic growth. And then the final argument that I would make is that as you make these transitions from a more mobilization to an efficiency economy, and from a young economy where most people are workers to an old economy where many people are retirees dependent on social services, you need to have a completely different governance system, and one that is more inclusive and participatory and service-oriented. That doesn't necessarily mean democracy and elections, but it does mean a governance system that is much more responsive to a wider range of human needs. All three of those transitions, I think, are very difficult. I think they're all achievable in the Chinese context, but they're clearly hard. So I'm going to try and not put too much economic jargon or charts into it, but there are a few pictures that I want to show that I hope will illustrate some of these abstract ideas and make them clearer. So the first one I'm going to show basically symbolizes what it means to go from a resource mobilization to an efficiency economy. And this is a picture of housing. So what we can see is the blue line shows, do I have a pointer here? I'm not sure that I do. Well, if you can follow the blue line, that is completions of housing every year in China. And you can see it went up steadily for 30 years in a row, basically, and went up very, very steeply. So every year, China built more houses than it did the year before for 30 years in a row. So your construction sector was growing very, very quickly, and this was providing a lot of demand for steel and cement and electricity and all these things. But now look what's happened in the last couple of years. It stopped growing, and we've done some research based on, what we expect urbanization and demographic trends to be over the next 10 years. And we're pretty convinced that over the next 10 years, construction of housing is actually going to have to fall by 10 or 15%. So it'll still be very high, but the point is for 30 years it was growing, and now it's not growing. And that's the change. For 30 years, you could reliably assume that however much you built last year, you're going to have to build that much more this year. And now you can't do that anymore. So that is well and truly the end of an era. And you can apply a similar chart to railways or highways or pretty much any kind of infrastructure. So this is the efficiency part. What we've done here is this is the return on investment, if you will, in industry for two types of companies. The red are state-owned companies, and the blue are basically private companies. And you can see that for a long time up until 2008, private companies always did better than state companies, but the gap was pretty constant over time. It wasn't all that large, and everyone was getting better and better at what they did. And that was because the state companies who were heavily involved in all this infrastructure and housing building were seeing very high returns, because every year you had to build more and more. But since 2008, you can see there's been a huge divergence. Private companies, everyone had a bad year in 2009, but then the private companies came back and have sustained very high rates of return on investment. But you can see the state-owned numbers have gotten worse and worse and worse. And so today, private companies basically generate a return on their investment that's 3 times higher than state companies do. And they do that with half as much debt as state companies do. So the thing that all economists complain about in China today is that growth is slower and slower and debt is higher and higher. Why? This is why. Because state companies are borrowing more and more money to finance investments that generate a lower and lower return. So if you want to solve that problem, you have to take money away from the state-owned enterprises and you have to give it to the private sector. And again, I'm simplifying a lot, but that's the core problem, the core policy issue for Chinese economy today. Finally, this is the demographic transition. So what I've done here is shown the what's called the dependency ratio. And what this is you just take the number of people who are not of working age. So these are youngsters under the age of 15 and old people over the age of 65. You add those two together, and then you divide it by the number of workers, people in working age population. So if you look back at the beginning of the chart, you can see in 1975, there were 8 dependents in China for every 10 workers. And most of those, you can see, were blue. Those were young people. So it was a very young population. 40 years later, there's less than 4 dependents for every worker. And that's because all those young people grew up and became workers, and they went into the workforce. And the birth rate went down, so you weren't creating so many new young people, and there just weren't that many old people to take care of. So that was very positive for the economy because you had a lot of workers, not too many dependent mouths to feed. You got a lot of economic growth, a lot of savings. But now, see what's happening is that the number of old people, the 65 and older, is rising very, very rapidly. And so we're heading into a very different demographic environment where you'll have many fewer workers and a lot more dependents. So that's the problem. So I'm going to leave you with 3 scenarios of what might occur, depending on whether the Chinese government is successful in meeting these challenges or not. And my basic view is there's a whole set of reforms that need to be done to the state-owned enterprises, service sector reform, to the financial sector. If these reforms are done over the next 3 or 4 years, if enough of them are done, then China, I think, can make a successful navigation through the middle income trap. If they're not done, then something bad will happen. So basically, I've given you 1 scenario where they succeed, and then 2, something bad happens. So the first one I call Singapore on steroids, and what that means is that they basically do enough of the reforms, they get the debt under control, they deregulate enough, they reallocate resources from the state sector to the private sector, you get a lot of growth, and the Communist Party gets credit for having successfully navigated this transition. And so 5 years from now, China is probably growing not as fast as it is now, but still probably around 5% a year, which would be a pretty good achievement. Debt is no longer rising, and the Communist Party, like the People's Party in Singapore, is highly legitimate and still in control. So it's, as the Chinese communists like to say, it's a win-win situation, unless you're a human rights activist, probably. And economically, China is very successful. Okay, that could well happen. But, as I've suggested, the challenges are very great, and it could well be that the government fails to make the necessary reforms. So if they fail, then what happens? Well, one thing that could happen is that the financial system could blow up. And a lot of newspaper headlines and financial analysts talk about this possibility all the time. There's all this debt. A lot of it is non-performing. The banks are in trouble. You could have a giant financial crisis. I think that's basically very unlikely. And if you want, later we can discuss precisely why. It gets a bit technical. But the basic reason is that China's financial system sits on top of an ocean of savings. So the saving rate in China, when you add up the saving of households, of companies, of government, it's about 45% of GDP, which is an extraordinarily high number. Most of that savings sits within the banking system in the form of deposits. As long as that ocean of deposits exists there, the government basically can solve any kind of financial problem by pushing money into it. So it's very, very unlikely that certainly in the next 2 or 3 years, that we'll see a financial crisis in China. And this is a difference that I have with many other analysts, because I think the probability of that is very low. On the other hand, I think there is another bad thing that could happen, which is that China could essentially follow in the footsteps of Japan in the 1990s. Like Japan, around that time, China has seen a huge buildup of debt that has financed very unproductive investments. Like Japan in the late 80s and early 90s, there were strong connections between giant big business enterprises and government bureaucracies. In Japan, they were private keiretsu. In China, they're state-owned enterprises, but the connections are very similar. And what happened in Japan was that the unproductive debt finally kind of collapsed. You had a lot of companies that were unable to repay. What they needed to do was they needed to restructure the economy, make it more dynamic, more competitive, slim down the big conglomerates, and allow more private enterprise. And they really didn't do any of those things, or they didn't do any of them enough. And the result was that they just let debt grow higher and higher and higher, growth got lower and lower and lower, and the economy stagnated. And in the late 1980s, people were saying many of the same things about Japan as they are about China today in terms of its being able to take over the world and investing everywhere. And a decade later, it was a very different story. So I think there is some risk that for similar reasons, China could face a similar set of stagnation dynamics as we saw in Japan. Now, I want to finish by exploring that a little bit further, because every time I talk a bit about this idea, people say, well, there are a lot of differences between Japan and China, right? And that's true. So I think it is important to think about, although I think this is a very possible scenario, there are some big differences. So I've just told you the similarities. There are two big differences. One is that although China faces a demographic time bomb, it's much earlier in that demographic transition than Japan was in 1990. So it's aging, but it's still a relatively young population. And then if you look at the average income and you look at the technological stage of development, China basically looks nothing at all like Japan in 1990. It looks a lot like Japan in the early 1970s, which was still an economy that had enormous growth potential in front of it. So there are certain financial things in China that look very bad. Okay, so this is debt levels relative to the economy. China is the red line. You can see it's been rushing up very, very high, and China now has more debt relative to the size of its economy than Japan, than South Korea, than the United States, than pretty much any European economy as well, and it's rising very rapidly. So that's the similarity. On the other hand, this is the ratio of workers to retirees. You can see that China, it's on a downward slope, but it's still at a very high level. There's still about 6 workers for every retiree compared to 2 in Japan today. So in 25 years, China will look like Japan today, and that's a problem, but they have some number of years to solve the problem. And then this is a very complicated chart with a lot of dots, but the basic idea is China is the red dots. The other East Asian economies are the other colored dots. When the other economies in Asia were at China's current level of income, they were still able to grow at 5% or so for another decade or even longer after that. So the point is that China has a lot of growth ahead of it. And then finally, China has a lot of growth in its consumer economy. The key here is to look at the red bars, which you can see are growing very rapidly. These are affluent consumer households that have at least $20,000 of income. Today, there are 80 million affluent households in China. In 10 years, even if growth slows quite a bit from the current level, there'll be twice that number. And these are the people who are buying high-end consumer goods, SUVs, healthcare services, educational services, new financial products like life insurance. They're taking foreign trips. This is a huge population of people driving potential growth. So basically what I leave you with there is I think there are a couple of different ways that China could go. There's definitely some potential for strong economic success. There's definitely, I would say, an equal possibility they get it wrong and wind up in a Japan-style stagnation trap. And the question really is, what is the leadership thinking about this choice, and which choice are they going to make? And I've suggested at the beginning that, as always with the Communist Party, there's a choice between a control agenda and a growth agenda. And for many years, they've been very clever about sacrificing small pieces of their control agenda to get the growth that then gives them more control in the long run. But I think we all have to agree that what we've seen from Xi Jinping in his first 3 years in office is he's basically a complete control freak. And he wants to control everything within the Communist Party, and he wants the Communist Party to control everything within society. And it's a little bit hard to see how that control agenda squares with the kind of liberalization that you need to get the growth that you need. So that is a deep concern. On the other hand, as I pointed out, there's this booming consumer market that could drive change from below. And then I think there's also simple survival, right? The Chinese Communist Party has always understood, as I said, that to survive in the long run, they have to get the economy right. They can't take the easy way out that Japan did, because Japan could say, well, if we don't grow, it doesn't matter because the United States will take care of our security interests. For China, they can't make that choice. They have to pay for their own security, and that means getting the economy right. So even though there's a control freak ethos in charge right now, I think it will certainly come under pressure in the coming years. So, as always, it will be a very interesting set of changes to watch, and maybe I'll come back here in a few years with my next book, which will tell you how it all turned out. So, with that, I'll hand it over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Arthur. That was very interesting, very amazingly concise and compressed tour of the subject. I'm going to open up to questions in a minute, and I hope you all got your questions ready. But I'm going to exercise my prerogative as the moderator to ask you the first few questions. And the first one, I guess, sort of occurred to me is that one thing you hear a lot in these types of discussions is that what I call China's leaders are very smart kind of school of thought. And people say, well, there are all these problems, but China's leaders are very smart. They understand all of this, and they kind of know what needs to be done. And I guess what I increasingly wonder is, what are the sort of the biggest obstacles to these reforms being introduced or taking place? And also, just sort of, for the next couple of years, what are the key sort of battlegrounds or sort of proof points that you're looking at that will give you an indication of which way it's going?
Okay, well, I'm not really an economist. I just play one on TV. I'm more of a journalist, so I can say rude things about the economics profession. And one thing I will observe is it should be a basic principle of economics when you're studying policy that very smart people can do very dumb things, because I think history tells us that very frequently happens. So yeah, China has relatively high quality leadership, but that doesn't mean, that's no guarantee that they won't do stupid things. What often happens is that you can be very smart in one environment, and then the environment changes, and then you're completely unprepared to deal with that environment. And I think that's the problem that we face now. Clearly, the Chinese leadership was very well adapted to the challenges of China in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, in this let's build a lot of stuff phase of growth. It is not at all clear that they are as well adapted to the new phase of growth, which is about letting markets have more space and letting consumers take over the driver's seat of the economy. They may not be up to that. And last year we saw some great examples. We had a big stock market bubble, which then crashed, and then the government intervened in a very ham-handed way and destroyed the credibility of the market. They wanted to liberalize the exchange rate a little bit, but then they mismanaged it, largely because they didn't understand how markets work and how markets would react to the changes that they made in the exchange rate. And again, it caused a global panic. And it's not obvious that the leadership is really up to the tasks that are demanded now, even though they're very well qualified, they're very experienced, they bring a lot of skill to it. So that I think that's a big issue. In terms of the challenges, I would really boil it down to one thing, which is that you have to have a clear direction to reduce the scope of the state sector and increase the scope of the private sector. And I don't really care about the speed of that. It could happen very slowly and incrementally, but the direction needs to be clear. And as long as I've been watching China, there's always been, debates about economic policy and different factional disputes and so forth. But for most of that time, there was very little doubt about the overall general direction that the top leaders wanted to pursue. And sometimes it was faster and sometimes it was slower, but the direction was clear. And most private entrepreneurs in China have depended on that. They live in a situation where they don't really have strong property rights. They don't have a legal system. There's nothing they can depend on other than their faith that basically the government has been driving towards a system that will be more beneficial for them in the long run. And the explosion of the private sector in China over the last 30 years, I think, has been based on that faith that the direction was clear. Now the direction is not clear at all. You get conflicting signals from the government. We want more private enterprises, but we want the state to be the core. We're going to have mixed ownership of state enterprises, but we don't want to let private individuals be part of that mixed ownership, so we're just going to have other state entities be mixed owners. What does it mean? No one knows. And so the result is that private investment is slowing every month because people just don't know what the story is. So I think the single most important thing that could be done is for the government to set a much, much clearer direction about its willingness to contemplate a more restricted, more streamlined role for the state sector and to much more unambiguously free up many controlled sectors to private sector competition. And if you get that signal and it's credible, then I think that would make a huge difference. If you don't get that signal, then I think there will be a lot of economic policy just spinning its wheels.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more and then I'm going to open it up. Because my background is writing a lot about the banking sector, and I have to say that, I see terrifying things happening in the Chinese banking sector. And also, I wonder, when you look at some of the sort of the examples you talked about, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all of these countries in their development, the development was punctuated by various crises. It didn't stop the growth, they didn't collapse, but then they had a crisis and then they carried on. So China's almost sort of unique in the sense that it hasn't had any of these crises. And I guess I wonder, sort of, what do you think, it's almost like, what do you think has to go, what are all the things that have to go right in order for China to manage this transition without having some sort of crisis?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think right now we have a situation where it's clear that what the government is trying to do for the next year or two is just throw as much debt into the system to keep growth stable until the next party Congress is done. I think that is very, very obvious. And the problem, I think they can do that. The problem is that pushes all of the problems down the road another couple of years. It makes them worse and more costly to deal with. So I think by staving off problems now, the government is almost increasing the likelihood that there'll be some kind of bad event later on because they're increasing the cost of dealing with them. As I suggested, I think the desire for control and stability is so strong that the way that this could play out is that they just make a decision, all right, we're going to have stability at all costs, and if that means driving growth down to zero, but we think that we still have enough cash to spread around to keep everyone happy so we can stay in power, that might be a decision that ultimately, and I don't think that would be a conscious decision that they would make, but it would sort of be a creeping decision that would occur over the course of 7-8 years kind of by accident, and then suddenly you would wake up and, oh, we're not growing and there's too much debt and there's nothing we can do about it, whatever. But I think one of the differences is, between China and these other countries is that it does have this powerful one-party state that is, it's not like the dictatorships that Korea and Taiwan had. It goes much, much deeper into society. It tries to control everything at some level, and it is completely obsessed with stability at all costs. And I think that's kind of what forestalls the kind of a blow-up scenario.
Okay, questions from the audience. If you just raise your hand and ask Arthur anything. One over there.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation of your book. You spoke extensively about the leadership and what could be done and what could be expected from the changes. So can you elaborate a bit about the aspiration of the middle class and what our changes could come from the bottom?
Okay, well, so first thing is, I will tell you, I really hate the term middle class when it's applied to China, and it's not the bottom, it's the top. So let's talk about that. So this is our picture of Chinese consumers, and the different bars represent the number of households in different income categories. So the black bars are what we call the emerging consumers, and these are people who have household incomes that are basically between, well, you have the renminbi numbers there, but they're basically between about $8,000 and $13,000 US dollars, right? The blue lines are sort of more moderate consumers that have income between $13,000 and $20,000. And the red bars are what we call the affluent consumers with $20,000 of household income. and it's the affluent guys who are often referred to as the emerging middle class of China, who actually represent the upper end of the income distribution, that are the drivers of growth. So the first observation that I would make is that even when you add all of these groups together, they are still a minority of the total Chinese population. They will become a majority pretty soon. But if you take the top group, even 10 years from now, they'll only represent maybe 20 or 25% of the Chinese population. So these people, I think, in general, in political respects, are largely status quo type of people. The system is basically working for them. Their incomes are rising. They've got a pretty good deal. Any problems, they have the means to solve them. And the last thing that they want to do is some kind of political reform that will hand over power to a wider group of people who might have very different interests, and many of whom live in the countryside and are viewed as having completely different interests. So I think the notion that this rising group of affluent consumers is going to be a major force for political change in certainly the next 5 years, and probably the next 10 years, I think this is basically misguided. What they can do, and what they have shown an ability to do, is influence the government policy on certain things that they really want, namely clean air, clean water, safer food. There's been a lot of citizen pressure on those issues, and there has been material response in the eastern coastal cities to try and provide a better environment and to clean up food supply chains so that they're safer. So I think at the micro level on this issue or that issue, specific issues of concern, I think pressure from this group is having an influence in government policy and is an important constraint. I'm very skeptical, though, that they will sort of lead the charge for any kind of large political change. I think if you turn to the economic realm, my hope would be that essentially this red group of consumers, these are people with very sophisticated demands, and their demands are the thing that could drive innovation in much of private industry, particularly in things like the internet and social media and finance and so forth. So you could see these people as being drivers of economic change and more innovative, market-driven solutions to problems, but only to the extent that the government allows space for that, and it's unclear at the moment.
Another question here? Just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. So you mentioned there might be three scenarios that might occur. The positive one was the currently Singapore ones. However, as we all know, that Singapore's size of economy and its size of nation is relatively small, definitely compared to China's one. So when the size become much bigger, is that gonna causing more troubles for China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very clearly true, that you can't make a strict comparison between Singapore, which only has 5 million people and is essentially one city, and a gigantic country with however many more times the population and huge discrepancies between urban and rural incomes and so forth. But that's meant, not totally seriously. But I think the idea, if you think about what is the ideal of the Communist Party leadership, it is a country that looks as much as possible like Singapore. Strong, economically strong, technologically advanced, ruled by one party, and not much permitted dissent. That's the nirvana that the Communist Party would like to get to. And they've done a pretty good job, actually, of getting in that direction, given that they have this enormous country to deal with. But, I think political analysts would definitely say, look, in the long run, it is probably impossible to run an entire country on that basis, and certainly a country as large and diverse as China. So I think it's legitimate to say, on a slightly longer term horizon, not maybe the next 5 years, but maybe 10, 15 years down the road, as the urban population matures and becomes the majority, that the problems of governance become so complicated that you can't sustain this kind of neat Singapore solution, and then there has to be a much bigger political realignment. I think that's very plausible. But my only point is that if you're expecting that kind of thing to happen in the next 5 years or probably even the next 10, that's unrealistic. I think we have to wait a bit longer.
Oh, lots of hands. Just one here first. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question is like when you talk about China, you don't look at the context of other country because when I look at it, when I go to shops, I can see, a couple years ago, I can see all the merchandise are making in China. But now they are making in Vietnam or maybe Pakistan and some other countries. So other countries using the same model as well to be like more like export driven. So are directly competing with China. And the second point I want to make is like when you talk about economy, you usually talk about is political economy as well. China is flexing the muscle. China is building up the military as well. So I think there's a lot of things, there would be a lot of animosity between other countries as well too. Okay, so in effect, when you come to making investment decisions, just like you say, foreign direct investment, when I make a decision, whether I would put in China or other country like Southwest China, then I would think about it when you're flexing your muscle. Okay. The third thing I want to talk about is more like when you talk about the debt, because you didn't elaborate a lot on that. Because last 3 years I've been traveling to China, like in Beijing. You know that I cannot remember exactly the part of Beijing. The thing I remember is more like for one railroad station, that was like the end of the southern part. I can see the whole area is office buildings. I don't see why they have the absorption rate for that many office buildings. Last year I went to Luoyang. They have about 2 million population, but then they built up the building for 4 million people can live on that. And last month I went to Shanxi. I was surprised that when I see so many office building and apartment building built in a rural area. And there's no sense for it. And they're building a lot of things on logistic parks. So the thing I want to make is, when they're doing accumulating debt, that means they're using resources of the next generation. They are lucky because there's because the interest rate is zero at this time. But what happens if the interest rate grow? Then the debt is going to explode. Because I've seen the world, I've seen this part of the world as well.
Yeah, okay. So 3 questions. I hope I can keep them all in my head. On the first one, yeah, it's clear that China is losing competitiveness in certain kinds of industries, but it's gaining competitiveness in other industries. And certain kinds of industries like the electronics industry and so forth depends heavily on clustering effects, so it's very hard for small pieces of it to move. So when we look at China's overall trade picture, yeah, some stuff is moving to Cambodia or Vietnam or whatever, but in aggregate, China is still attracting huge amounts of foreign direct investment and is more competitive on exports in total than any other country in Asia. So I don't really think that that's a problem. There's a change in composition there. In terms of China's kind of military assertiveness, yes, I think this is a big issue. I don't think China has handled its relationships with its neighbors very well. It's created a lot of bad feeling. And I think this is a problem, but so I'm an American. I spend a lot of time talking to American companies and the American government. And there's a big dilemma right now because, in the United States, there's a very, very clear sense that China is a rising competitor, not just in an economic sense, but in a political and a military sense. So people want to be very cautious about how the U.S. engages with China. On the other hand, the companies say, well, China is our biggest market, and it's the one that's growing the fastest. We can't just walk away from it. And I think that's a dilemma, basically, that all of the countries in Asia face that surround China. Yeah, China is kind of mean, and it's kind of a bully. It's kind of annoying. On the other hand, our economic future really depends on some kind of integration with China. All I can say is that it's a tricky problem, and China, in the bargaining that occurs there, China holds a lot of cards because its market is so valuable to so many people. And then the final question was on debt. Yes, no question, there's been a lot of waste. There's been a lot of building that's been done that probably won't ever come to fruition. I still, the reality is that in almost any successful economy, you can find similar examples. If you go to Florida, you can see layer upon layer of real estate bubbles of the past and abandoned residential developments and so forth. I still come to the conclusion that when you add up the total situation in China, yes, there's debt problems. Yes, there's excess capacity problems. These are going to be difficult to manage, but they aren't necessarily crippling. And there is abundant saving in the society that can, if it's used properly, can solve these problems. That doesn't mean to say that it will be easy or that it will be done, just that I think it can be done.
Okay, we had one question here, lady here, and then we'll come to the back. If you could keep your question relatively succinct, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Towards the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that Japan in 1990s, its policymakers made a few mistakes that if China repeat, then we may fall into stagnation as well. And I remember towards the middle of the presentation, you mentioned, for example, if, like Japan didn't slim its conglomerates fast enough in the 1990s. Are there other mistakes that China should be cautious of in the upcoming years?
Yeah, so there's basically two, I think, errors that China needs to be careful about. First of all, Japan spent most of the first years of the 1990s denying that it had a bad debt problem and pretending that it wasn't there, right? And that is in strong contrast to China in the late 1990s under Zhu Rongji, which also had a bad debt problem, but they recognized it and they worked very decisively to take the bad debts out of the banks, put them in a dark corner, basically, and then freed the banks to make new productive investments. So the first and most important thing is to recognize that you have a bad debt problem, remove the bad debts from the banks into some other special vehicle, and then restructure both the banks and the people that borrow from the banks in a way that you can be sure that new bank lending is going to be productive and generate a lot of economic growth. And if you do those things, then you're probably okay. Japan did not do that. They delayed and delayed and delayed and just waited way too long to resolve their debt problem. So that is point one, is you have a bad debt problem, deal with it, and deal with it fast. The second one is that Japan needed to restructure its economy to create more space for smaller scale entrepreneurship and more vitality in service industries. And they didn't really do that. So China similarly needs to deregulate its service industries, create more space for private sector companies. And one of the reasons that you do that is that once you take the bad loans out of the banks and close down the state-owned enterprises that are wasting the money, the banks need someone to lend to. And these private companies in these deregulated sectors become borrowers from the banks. So you need to have those people both to create more productivity and to ensure that you have a way for credit to flow through the system in a way that generates growth rather than just more bad debts. So I would focus on those two things: deregulation, particularly of service sectors, so there's more space for private companies, and quick and decisive resolution of the bad debt problems in the banks.
Good, we had a question here, young man with a green shirt on. And then we'll come to that.
Thank you. How do you think income inequality is going to affect governmental policy in China in general?
Well, it's already had a big impact. So I think the government of Hu Jintao that came in 2003 was very concerned about the inequality between the cities and the countryside. And they instituted a lot of policies to try and narrow that gap. And in fact, after a period of about 7 or 8 years, those had an impact. And so the gap between urban and rural incomes has started to shrink in the last few years. So it's already had that impact. I think the other thing that the last government did is that they realized that they needed more of a social safety net. So unemployment insurance, pensions for old people, more health care and education paid for by the state. So spending on that increased quite a bit after 2005. So I think the government has already done a few things to address inequality. It hasn't done enough because China continues to be one of the most unequal societies on earth. And I have to say, in writing my book, this was one of the starkest conclusions that I came to, which is if you look at why is inequality so great in China? The biggest single reason is that people in cities and people in the countryside have different property rights. So if you live in a city and you want to buy a house, you can buy a house. And if you want to sell that house, you can sell the house and you can pocket the profits. If you want to pass that house on down to your son or daughter, you can do that. You have an unrestricted right to own property. And a lot of people got kind of a windfall because there was a housing privatization in the late 80s and early 90s where people who were sitting in state-owned enterprise apartments could buy those for very small amounts of money, far below their market value. And then years later, they could sell them for the market value, and they got a huge, huge windfall from that. In the countryside, farmers still can't own their land, and they probably never will be able to. They have the right to use it for a pretty short period of time, 30 years. But they don't have the same ability to buy it or sell it or realize its true value. And so this embeds within society a huge gap between people in the cities, and particularly people who lived in the cities in the late 90s and early 2000s and got this big present, and everybody else. And fundamentally, I don't think that the inequality problems in China can ever be solved unless there's a willingness to face this underlying problem of the difference between urban and rural property rights, which are very, very beneficial for people in the cities and very bad for people in the countryside. And what we see now from the government is that they aren't willing to do that. So in certain ways, the government has been responsive to the inequality problem and has tried hard to solve it. And in other ways, I think they really have ignored the root causes, unfortunately.
Very good. We had lady at the back here, question.
Could you just quickly to position your book or why you wrote this book at this time? The reason I ask this question because we often read so many different books about China, the present China, both from the Western author and also Chinese, Hong Kong, Taiwanese, analysis. And some perspectives are from the grassroots, lower class. Some are from, like you, maybe more like a formal macroeconomic views. So a lot of theories or ideas are conflicted. Predictions are also contradictory. We have totally opposite scenario for China in the next 10 years, which are fine, which is okay. I'm just curious about, from your first person perspective, how you position this book. Why do you write it now?
Yeah.
And what do you see the value of this book in 10 years of time? Yeah. If it's okay for me to ask.
Wow, yeah, that's okay. So for answer the first question is very simple. Why did I write the book now? Well, the publishers came to me and said, would you like to write this book? And I said yes. So that is, so why did I say yes? I said yes because I'd been hanging around China for a very long time, writing small things, and I was actually looking for an opportunity to pull it all together and try to synthesize many, many years of observations into a complete set of ideas. The second thing was I actually thought when I talked about it with the publishers, there was very clearly a gap in the market. I'm often asked by my clients, I'll give them a briefing and tell them about this or that. And they say, so what's the one book that I can read that will just tell me everything that I need to know? And I said, well, okay, there is this one book. It was published a few years ago. It's 900 pages long, and it's a collection of very dense essays by leading academics. And you could try that, but you probably won't like it, right? So the reality was that there was no book out there that gave a comprehensive, easy-to-understand view of the last 35 years of China's economic development in a way that most people could understand. So that seemed like a worthy task. I don't think that this book will have much value in 10 years' time because things change too quickly. So my publishers promised me that if this is successful, we can do a second edition in 3 or 4 years that will update it and correct all the mistakes. I mean, that is a big problem of any book on China, is that things change so rapidly that the shelf life of any particular volume is pretty limited, and I'm realistic about that.
We probably have time for one more question if there's anybody who's got a burning question. Have we exhausted all questions on this? In that case, I think we'll bring it to an end. There's a very nice quote in the book from a Chinese official at the beginning of the book where you talk about, describes the sort of the reform of China as walking on a tightrope over a bottomless pit, and the rope behind you is on fire, which is just this great image, I think, for kind of the challenge that China faces and the Chinese leaders faces. But hopefully, Arthur, you'll come back in a few years' time and tell us a bit more about how that tightrope walking act kind of continued. Exactly. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your speech. Thank you all very much for very interesting questions. And please join me in thanking Arthur for a very fascinating talk.